The beeping of machines had become my lullaby for 6 weeks, but nothing could have prepared me for the phone call that shattered my recovery. I was finally sitting up without help, my shattered ribs healing from the head-on collision that nearly took my life, when the hospital phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to Robert Kim, a notary I'd never heard of, and his words made my blood freeze. "Miss Rodriguez, I need to speak with you about some irregularities regarding the sale of your grandmother's property on Elm Street. There are signature discrepancies that require immediate attention. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." The confusion hit me like a second collision. Sale? What sale? Grandmother Rose had left me her beloved adobe house in her will just 8 months ago, the place where she'd spent 40 years creating watercolor masterpieces in her converted garage studio. The house where I'd spent every summer learning to paint, where she'd whispered stories of her childhood in Mexico, where she'd made me promise to keep her art alive somehow. I gripped the phone with trembling fingers, my voice barely above a whisper, as I told Mr. Kim there had to be some mistake. But there was no mistake. As consciousness fully returned to my foggy, medication-dulled brain, the pieces began forming a horrifying picture. David, my younger brother, had somehow sold grandmother's house while I lay unconscious in intensive care. The same house that represented everything she'd worked for, everything she'd dreamed of, leaving behind. The same house that was supposed to fund the community art center I'd planned to build in her memory. Mr. Kim's voice grew more concerned as he explained the timeline. 3 weeks ago, while I was still in a medically induced coma following my 3rd surgery, someone claiming to be Emma Rodriguez had signed the sale documents. The signature looked close enough to pass initial inspection, but upon closer examination, the notary had noticed subtle differences. The buyer, a development company called Phoenix Rising Properties, had paid $450,000 cash for the property. The money had been deposited into an account I'd never opened. My heart monitor started beeping frantically as the reality crashed over me. David had been my emergency contact, the one making medical decisions while I fought for my life. He'd had access to my personal documents, my identification, everything he needed to forge my signature. But more than that, he'd exploited the most vulnerable moment of my life to steal the one thing that mattered most to me. The nurse rushed in, concerned about my elevated vitals, but I waved her away. I needed to understand how this was possible. Mr. Kim explained that David had presented himself as my power of attorney, claiming I was permanently incapacitated and needed the house sold to pay for my medical expenses. He'd provided medical documents that suggested I might never wake up, never be able to make decisions for myself again. The development company, eager to acquire property in the rapidly gentrifying Maryvale neighborhood, had fast-tracked the sale. As the initial shock wore off, rage began building in my chest, competing with the broken ribs for space to breathe. David knew how much that house meant to me. He'd sat beside Grandmother Rose during her final weeks, as she made me promise to preserve her legacy. He'd helped me clean out her art supplies, had seen the tears in my eyes as I carefully packed away her unfinished paintings. He'd nodded along when I shared my dreams of converting the space into a community center, where local kids could learn art for free, just like Grandmother had taught me. But David had always been different from the rest of us. Where our family valued art, creativity, and community, David worshipped money and status. His expensive apartment in Scottsdale, his designer clothes, his Tesla that he could barely afford, these things mattered more to him than family history or sentimental value. Still, I never imagined he would go this far. I never thought he would literally steal my inheritance while I lay dying in a hospital bed. Mr. Kim continued explaining the legal situation. Because of the suspicious circumstances and the timing of my accident, he'd filed a preliminary report with the authorities. The sale could potentially be reversed, but it would require extensive legal proceedings. The development company had acted in good faith, believing they were purchasing from the rightful owner. They'd already begun preliminary demolition planning, excited about their acquisition of such a prime development location. The thought of bulldozers tearing down Grandmother's studio made me physically ill. Those walls held decades of artistic dreams, paint stains that told stories, windows positioned perfectly to catch the morning light she loved so much. The garden where she'd grown the flowers she painted, the kitchen where she'd taught me to make her famous tres leches cake. The living room, where we'd spent countless hours discussing color theory and brush techniques. All of it would be gone, replaced by generic condominiums that could house anyone, but would never again house our family's heart. As I hung up the phone, my mind raced through the implications. David hadn't just stolen money. He'd stolen my future, my plans, my connection to the woman who'd shaped my entire artistic identity. He'd gambled that I would never wake up to discover his betrayal. But I was awake now, and despite the pain shooting through my healing body, despite the monitors and tubes still attached to me, I was more determined than ever to fight back. The afternoon sun streaming through my hospital window felt different now, charged with purpose instead of peaceful recovery. David thought he'd won, thought he'd solved whatever financial problems had driven him to such desperate measures. He had no idea that his little sister, the one he'd underestimated his entire life, was about to become his biggest nightmare. The first person I called was my mother, Patty, hoping against hope that this was all some terrible misunderstanding. Maybe David had acted with good intentions. Maybe there was some medical emergency I didn't know about. Maybe the family had made this decision together while I was unconscious. The phone rang 3 times before her familiar voice answered, cheerful and unsuspecting. "Emma, honey, how are you feeling today? We were just talking about when you might be coming home." Her voice carried that forced brightness she always used when she was nervous. The same tone she'd employed when telling me as a child that our dog had gone to live on a farm upstate. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." My voice was steadier than I felt, but there was an edge to it that made her pause. "Did you know David sold grandmother's house?" The silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed completely, losing all pretense of cheerfulness. "Oh, sweetheart, you're awake enough to understand complex things now. That's wonderful progress." The deflection hit me like a physical blow. She'd known. Not only had she known, but she'd been part of whatever decision-making process had led to this betrayal. "Mom, answer the question. Did you know he sold the house?" "Emma, you have to understand. We thought we might lose you. The doctors weren't sure you'd ever wake up properly, and David was so worried about the medical bills. Your insurance has been fighting some of the coverage, and we didn't know what else to do. The house was just sitting there empty, and David said you'd mentioned before that maintaining it was becoming expensive." Every word felt like another nail in the coffin of my trust. I'd never mentioned the house being expensive to maintain because it wasn't. Grandmother Rose had kept it in perfect condition, and the property taxes were reasonable for the area. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. More importantly, I'd never expressed any desire to sell it. Ever. In fact, I'd specifically told my entire family about my plans to convert it into an art center, a conversation that had taken place at David's birthday dinner just 3 months before my accident. "Mom, I was in a coma for 2 weeks, not 2 years, and I've been conscious and talking for 4 weeks now. Why didn't anyone mention this to me? Why am I finding out from a notary who noticed irregularities in the signature?" Another pause, this one filled with the kind of guilty silence that spoke volumes. When she responded, her voice had taken on a defensive quality that I recognized from childhood arguments. "We didn't want to stress you while you were recovering. You've been through so much trauma, and we thought it would be better to handle these practical matters without burdening you." The word burden hung in the air like a toxic cloud. My grandmother's house, my inheritance, my future plans, all reduced to a burden that needed to be handled without my input. "Where's Dad? I want to talk to him too." "He's at work. But Emma, please don't get yourself worked up over this. What's done is done, and David used the money responsibly. He put it toward that technology investment opportunity he's been researching. It could really pay off for the whole family." The technology investment. David had been talking for months about some blockchain startup that promised astronomical returns. He'd tried to convince me to invest my savings several times, becoming increasingly agitated when I'd refused. Now I understood why he'd been so persistent, why he'd seemed so desperate to find investors. He'd already committed to something he couldn't afford and needed my house money to cover his obligations. "Mom, do you hear yourself right now? You're telling me that David forged my signature to steal my inheritance and gamble it on some risky investment. And you think I shouldn't be upset because it might pay off for the family?" My voice was rising and I could feel my heart rate increasing, but I didn't care anymore. "Don't use that tone with me, young lady. David is trying to build a future for himself and Ashley. They want to get married and buy a house of their own. This investment could set them up for life. Your grandmother would have wanted her money to help the family succeed. The audacity of invoking Grandmother Rose's wishes while defending the destruction of her life's work left me speechless for a moment. Grandmother Rose, who had spent her final months making me promise to keep her art alive, who had specifically left me the house because she knew I understood its artistic and cultural significance. The woman who had told David repeatedly that money wasn't everything, that family legacy and creativity mattered more than financial gain. Grandmother Rose wanted her house to become an art center. We talked about it extensively. She knew exactly what I planned to do with it, and that's why she left it to me specifically. David was supposed to be the backup executor in case something happened to me, not the person who would steal it the moment I was vulnerable. You're being dramatic, Emma. It's just a house. Houses can be replaced. David's future can't wait forever, and this opportunity has a deadline. Besides, you'll get your share when the investment pays off. David promised to split any profits with you. Just a house, the place where 4 generations of Rodriguez women had created art, where my great-grandmother had taught Grandmother Rose to weave, where Grandmother Rose had taught my mother to paint, before Mom had decided that art was impractical, where I had discovered my own artistic voice. Just a house that was about to be demolished, to make way for luxury condominiums, that would price out the very community Grandmother Rose had wanted to serve. What happens if the investment doesn't pay off, Mom? What happens if David loses all the money? I already knew the answer, but I needed to hear her say it. That won't happen. David researched this thoroughly. The company has patents and everything. Besides, even if something goes wrong, you still have your job and your health. You can rebuild. David might not get another opportunity like this. There it was. The fundamental inequality that had defined our family dynamic my entire life. David's opportunities mattered more than my inheritance. David's future mattered more than my recovery. David's dreams mattered more than my grandmother's legacy. I was expected to be grateful that he'd stolen from me because it might benefit him, and I was supposed to accept the loss because I was strong enough to rebuild from nothing. I want to talk to David. Now. He's not available right now. He and Ashley are meeting with investors in Scottsdale. But Emma, please think about this rationally. Family is more important than property. We need to stick together, especially after what you've been through. The irony of her talking about family solidarity while defending theft was almost laughable. Family would have asked my permission. Family would have waited for me to recover before making decisions about my inheritance. Family wouldn't have forged my signature and lied to a notary. Nobody forged anything. David had medical power of attorney while you were unconscious. He was legally authorized to make decisions on your behalf. That was the first outright lie she'd told during our conversation, and we both knew it. Medical power of attorney covered healthcare decisions, not financial transactions involving personal property. David had committed fraud, pure and simple, and my parents were not only complicit but actively defending his actions. My hands shook as I dialed David's number, the hospital phone feeling impossibly heavy against my ear. The call went straight to voicemail, his cocky voice telling me he was probably doing something more important than answering my call, but to leave a message anyway. I hung up without speaking and immediately called back. Voicemail again. On the 3rd attempt, Ashley answered. Emma, oh my God, how are you feeling? David's been so worried about you. Her voice carried that saccharine sweetness she always used when she wanted something, the same tone she'd employed when asking to borrow my car or my designer dress for some event she couldn't afford to dress appropriately for. Where is he, Ashley? I need to speak with him immediately. He's in a really important meeting right now, but I can have him call you back later tonight. Is everything okay? You sound upset. The casual way she asked if everything was okay, as if she didn't know exactly why I was calling, made my blood pressure spike. Everything is not okay. Your boyfriend stole my house while I was unconscious, and I want to know why. Ashley's pause was telling. When she spoke again, the fake sweetness had evaporated, replaced by something harder and more calculated. Emma, that's not really how it happened. David made a difficult decision to help the family during a crisis. The medical bills were piling up, and your parents were stressed about money. He was trying to protect everyone. Protect everyone from what? My insurance is covering the medical expenses. There was no financial crisis that required selling my inheritance without my knowledge or consent. Well, that's not what David understood from your parents. They told him you might not recover fully, and someone needed to make practical decisions about your assets. He's been managing everything while you've been sick. The way she said sick, instead of fighting for my life, revealed everything I needed to know about how they'd been discussing my situation. I wasn't a person who'd survived a traumatic accident. I was an inconvenience whose prolonged recovery had disrupted their plans. Ashley, I want you to listen to me very carefully. David forged my signature on legal documents to steal $450,000 from me. That's called fraud, and it's a felony. The fact that you're defending it makes you an accessory after the fact. You don't need to threaten us, Emma. We're family. David was going to tell you about the investment opportunity once you were feeling better. He wanted to surprise you with how much money he could make for all of us. An investment opportunity that he couldn't afford without stealing from me. What kind of investment was so urgent that it couldn't wait for me to wake up and make my own decisions about my own property? Ashley's voice dropped to a whisper, and I could hear her moving to a more private location. Look, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but David's been under a lot of pressure lately. He borrowed some money from investors for his tech startup, and they want their return by the end of next month. This blockchain thing, it's not just an opportunity, it's his way out of a really bad situation. Finally, the truth began emerging. David hadn't seen an investment opportunity. He'd been desperate to cover existing debts. My house hadn't been sold to help the family. It had been liquidated to save his failing business ventures and prevent whatever consequences he was facing from angry investors. How much money did he borrow, Ashley? I don't know the exact amount, but it's substantial. He's been losing sleep over it for weeks. When your accident happened, and you were unconscious for so long, he saw it as a sign that maybe this was the solution he'd been praying for. A solution. My near-death experience had been convenient for David's financial problems. The house that represented 4 generations of family history had been reduced to a, quote, solution for his poor business decisions. Ashley, do you understand what he's planning to do with that property? The buyers are going to demolish it completely. Grandmother Rose's art studio, all her work, everything she built there, it's all going to be destroyed to build condominiums. Emma, you can't live in the past forever. Your grandmother is gone, and holding on to old buildings isn't going to bring her back. David is trying to build something for our future together. We want to get married and buy a house in North Scottsdale, somewhere nice where we can start a family. The casual dismissal of Grandmother Rose's legacy as, quote, living in the past, crystallized everything wrong with David's values and Ashley's influence on him. They saw dollar signs where I saw family history. They saw inconvenient sentimentality where I saw cultural preservation. That house was worth more than money, Ashley. It was going to become a community art center where kids from the neighborhood could learn to paint and create, just like Grandmother Rose taught me. She specifically left it to me because she knew I would honor that vision. That's a nice dream, Emma, but dreams don't pay bills. David is being practical about the family's financial future. Your arts center idea sounds lovely, but it would never generate the kind of income that this investment opportunity could provide. Income for who? David gambled money he didn't have and lost. Now he's stolen from me to cover his debts. How is that being practical about anyone's future except his own? Ashley's voice hardened completely now. David hasn't stolen anything. He made a difficult decision during a family emergency. Your parents agreed with him. You were unconscious and couldn't contribute to the decision-making process. Someone had to take charge. Taking charge would have been waiting for me to wake up. Taking charge would have been consulting with me about my own inheritance. Taking charge would have been finding legitimate solutions to his financial problems instead of committing fraud. You're being really harsh, Emma. David loves you. We both do. He never wanted to hurt you, but sometimes adults have to make hard choices that kids don't understand. Kids. Ashley was 3 years younger than me, and David was my younger brother, but somehow I was the kid who didn't understand adult decisions. The condescension in her voice made me realize that this conversation was pointless. Ashley genuinely believed that David was justified in his actions, that my attachment to Grandmother Rose's house was childish sentimentality that needed to be overcome for the greater good of David's financial future. Put David on the phone now, Ashley. I'm not asking anymore. He really is in meetings, Emma. Important people flew in from California just to discuss this opportunity with him. I can't interrupt that. Then tell him he has until tonight to call me back and explain himself, or I'm calling the police and reporting the fraud. I have the notary's documentation of the signature irregularities, and I have proof that David exceeded his legal authority as medical power of attorney. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if Ashley had hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a new quality, something between fear and anger. Emma, you need to think very carefully about what you're threatening. If you cause problems for David's business deal, you'll hurt the whole family. Your parents are counting on this investment to help with their retirement. Everyone will suffer if you destroy this opportunity over sentimental attachment to an old house. The attempt to manipulate me through guilt was so transparent it was almost insulting. David had stolen from me, but somehow I would be responsible for hurting the family if I sought justice. My parents had betrayed my trust, but I was supposed to protect their financial interests at the expense of my own. Ashley, I want you to deliver a message to David. Tell him that he has 24 hours to figure out how to reverse the sale of my house. Or I'm going to make sure that every investor, every business partner, and every person he's ever borrowed money from knows exactly what kind of person they're dealing with. The phone call from the bank came at 6 a.m, waking me from the first real sleep I'd managed since discovering David's betrayal. The voice belonged to Sandra Martinez from First National, and her tone carried the kind of professional concern that immediately put me on high alert. Ms. Rodriguez, this is regarding some unusual activity we've detected on an account that was recently opened in your name. We're calling because the account setup and initial deposit don't match our typical customer patterns, and we wanted to verify that you authorized these transactions. My stomach dropped as Sandra explained what she'd discovered. Someone had opened a checking account using my social security number and identification, depositing exactly $450,000 in cash 3 weeks ago. The account had been accessed multiple times since then, with large wire transfers going out to various business entities and investment firms. Ms. Martinez, I never opened any account with your bank. I've been hospitalized for 6 weeks following a car accident, and I only became fully conscious 4 weeks ago. Someone has been impersonating me. The silence on Sandra's end spoke volumes. When she continued, her voice carried the gravity of someone delivering news that would change everything. Ms. Rodriguez, I need to inform you that whoever opened this account had extensive documentation, including medical records suggesting you were permanently incapacitated and that your brother had been granted full financial power of attorney. The documentation appeared legitimate enough to satisfy our verification requirements. David hadn't just forged my signature on the house sale. He'd created an entire false narrative about my condition and his legal authority. He'd somehow obtained copies of my medical records and manipulated them to support his fraud. The scope of his deception was staggering. I need copies of everything, I told Sandra. Every document he provided, every transaction record, every piece of paper associated with that account, and I need you to freeze all activity immediately. We've already frozen the account pending investigation, but Ms. Rodriguez, I have to tell you that most of the money is already gone. There's approximately $47,000 remaining. $400,000 vanished in 3 weeks. David hadn't just invested my house money. He'd gone on a spending spree that defied comprehension. Sandra walked me through the transaction history, each withdrawal feeling like another knife in my back. $80,000 to Phoenix Rising Investments, the same blockchain company David had mentioned. $60,000 to Luxury Auto Solutions, apparently for a new BMW he'd purchased for Ashley. $45,000 to Scottsdale Jewelers for what appeared to be an engagement ring and wedding band set. $28,000 to Desert Dream Venues for what looked like wedding deposits. $37,000 to various high-end retailers and restaurants throughout Scottsdale. My brother had literally spent my inheritance on his engagement and wedding planning while I lay unconscious in a hospital bed. He'd bought his fiancée a car and himself a lifestyle upgrade using money stolen from my grandmother's legacy. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. Ms. Martinez, I need to file a formal fraud report with your bank, and I need you to provide all of this documentation to the police when I file criminal charges." "Of course, Miss Rodriguez." "I have to ask, though, are you certain you want to pursue criminal charges against a family member? Sometimes these situations can be resolved through civil proceedings without involving law enforcement." The question hung in the air like a challenge to my resolve. Sandra was giving me an out, a chance to handle this quietly within the family, to avoid the public scandal and criminal consequences that would destroy David's life. It was the same mentality that had allowed David to rationalize his actions in the first place. The idea that family obligations trumped legal and ethical boundaries. "Sandra, my brother stole nearly $500,000 from me while I was fighting for my life. He forged legal documents, committed identity theft, and destroyed my grandmother's life work for his personal gain. This isn't a family disagreement, it's multiple felonies." After hanging up with the bank, I called Robert Kim, the notary who'd first alerted me to the irregularities. His voice carried grim satisfaction when I explained what I'd discovered about the fake bank account and the extent of David's spending. "Miss Rodriguez, this information changes everything. What we initially thought was a simple case of signature fraud is actually a complex scheme involving identity theft, document forgery, and financial fraud. The criminal liability here is substantial." Robert explained that he'd been conducting his own investigation since our first conversation, working with the title company and the real estate agents involved in the sale. David had presented himself as my legal representative, providing medical documentation that painted me as permanently brain-damaged and unable to manage my own affairs. The medical records he provided were sophisticated forgeries. Someone with access to hospital systems had altered your actual records to suggest permanent cognitive impairment and vegetative state prognosis. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was premeditated fraud requiring significant planning and resources. The revelation that David had help in creating the false medical records opened up terrifying new possibilities. Someone with legitimate access to hospital computer systems had assisted him, which meant this conspiracy extended beyond my family. David had found healthcare professionals willing to commit fraud for money, putting other vulnerable patients at risk. "Mr. Kim, I need to know if there's any way to reverse the house sale. The buyers are planning to demolish the property, and once that happens, everything my grandmother built there will be gone forever." Robert's sigh was audible through the phone. "The legal situation is complicated because the buyers acted in good faith based on fraudulent documentation. They have a legitimate claim to the property even though the sale was criminal. However, if we can prove fraud quickly enough, we might be able to get an injunction to prevent demolition while the case proceeds through court." How quickly is quickly enough? The buyers have filed for demolition permits, but those take time to process. If we can get criminal charges filed and an injunction request submitted within the next few days, we might be able to freeze everything until the fraud case is resolved. Time was running out, not just for legal remedies but for my grandmother's physical legacy. Every day I delayed action brought the bulldozers closer to erasing 40 years of artistic creation and cultural history. "Mr. Kim, I want to file criminal charges against David today. I want to pursue every possible legal remedy to reverse this sale. And I want to make sure that whoever helped him forge those medical records faces consequences too. Ms. Rodriguez, I have to warn you that prosecuting your brother will likely destroy your family relationships permanently. Are you prepared for that level of conflict?" The question forced me to confront the reality of what lay ahead. Pursuing justice meant accepting that my relationship with David, and probably my parents, was over. It meant choosing my grandmother's legacy and my own principles over family harmony. But family harmony built on theft and betrayal wasn't worth preserving. A family that would rally around the criminal while abandoning the victim wasn't worth protecting. "Mr. Kim, my family relationships were destroyed the moment David decided to steal from me while I was unconscious. I'm just refusing to pretend otherwise anymore." As I hung up the phone, I realized that David's greatest miscalculation wasn't underestimating the legal consequences of his actions. His biggest mistake was assuming that I would prioritize family loyalty over justice, that I would quietly accept his betrayal to avoid making waves. He was about to learn that some people can't be bought, threatened, or manipulated into accepting injustice, even when it comes from the people who are supposed to love them most. David finally returned my call at 11 that night, his voice carrying a mixture of defiance and barely controlled panic. The confident swagger I'd grown accustomed to hearing in his tone had been replaced by something rawer, more desperate. "Emma, I heard you've been making some pretty serious accusations. Mom told me you're upset about the house situation, but I think you're misunderstanding what actually happened here." The word misunderstanding ignited something primal in my chest. After everything I'd discovered, after all the evidence of his systematic fraud, he was still trying to gaslight me into believing I was confused about my own victimization. "David, I know about the fake bank account. I know about the forged medical records. I know about the $80,000 you spent on your blockchain investment, the $60,000 for Ashley's BMW, and the $45,000 you dropped on engagement rings. I know everything." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "How did you find out about the account?" "The bank called me about suspicious activity. Apparently, impersonating someone to open fraudulent accounts triggers certain security protocols. Who would have thought?" "Emma, listen to me carefully. You don't understand the situation I was in. I had investors breathing down my neck, people who don't accept excuses when payment deadlines pass. If I hadn't found a way to cover my obligations, the consequences would have been severe for everyone in our family. So you decided to steal from your unconscious sister instead of facing the consequences of your own poor decisions. How noble of you, David." "It wasn't stealing. I was going to pay you back with interest once the blockchain investment matured. The projected returns were substantial enough to cover the house value plus give you a significant profit. You would have made money on the deal." The audacity of framing theft as a favor was staggering. David genuinely seemed to believe that because he'd had good intentions about eventual repayment, his crimes were somehow justified or even beneficial to me. "David, you forged medical records to make me appear permanently brain damaged. You created fake documentation about your legal authority. You opened fraudulent bank accounts in my name. These aren't business decisions, they're felonies. The medical records weren't fake, they were based on real information from your doctors. During the first week after your accident, the prognosis was genuinely uncertain. I just emphasized the more pessimistic projections to help the banks and title companies understand the urgency of the situation." Even now, he was spinning his crimes as reasonable interpretations of ambiguous circumstances. David had convinced himself that manipulating medical information was simply strategic communication rather than document forgery. "David, you spent $400,000 of my money in 3 weeks. Even if your investment had paid off, you clearly had no intention of limiting yourself to the house sale proceeds. You bought Ashley a luxury car. You bought expensive jewelry. You put deposits down on wedding venues. You went on a spending spree with money that wasn't yours. Those were necessary expenses for building our future together. Ashley deserves nice things, and our wedding needed to make the right impression on potential business contacts. Everything I spent was an investment in our family's long-term success." "Our family's success? David, you literally destroyed our family when you decided to steal from me. You broke every bond of trust that ever existed between us." "I saved our family. If those investors had decided to make an example of me, do you think they would have stopped with just me? They know where Mom and Dad live, they know about you. I protected everyone by finding a solution that didn't put anyone else at risk." The revelation that David had borrowed money from dangerous people added another layer of horror to his betrayal. He'd not only stolen from me but had potentially exposed our entire family to criminal retaliation by involving loan sharks or organized crime figures in his business ventures. "David, who exactly did you borrow money from? What kind of people are we talking about here? That's not important now. What matters is that I handled the situation without anyone getting hurt. The blockchain investment is still viable, and once it pays off, everyone will see that I made the right choice." "The blockchain investment that you put $80,000 into? David, that's less than 20% of what you stole from me. Where did the rest of the money go?" "I had other debts to settle, other obligations that needed to be handled quickly. The wedding expenses were necessary for maintaining our social standing while the investment matured. Ashley's car was a practical purchase since her old one was unreliable. Each justification revealed how completely David had divorced himself from reality. He'd somehow convinced himself that luxury purchases were practical necessities, and that maintaining social appearances was more important than honoring family obligations or legal boundaries. David, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Tomorrow morning, I'm filing criminal charges against you for fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse. I'm requesting an injunction to prevent the demolition of grandmother's house. I'm pursuing civil litigation to recover every penny you stole from me, plus damages. Emma, you can't be serious. I'm your brother. We're family. You can't destroy my life over a business disagreement. This isn't a business disagreement. This is you committing multiple felonies against me while I was unconscious and vulnerable. You made your choice when you decided to forge my signature. Now I'm making mine. If you file charges against me, it will ruin everything. Ashley will leave me. My business relationships will be destroyed. I'll lose my apartment, my car, everything I've worked for. Is that really what you want? The desperation in his voice might have moved me once, but now it only highlighted how completely he'd failed to understand the gravity of his actions. David was more concerned about the consequences to his lifestyle than the harm he'd caused to me or our family. David, you ruined everything the moment you decided to steal from me. I'm not destroying your life, I'm refusing to let you destroy mine. Mom and Dad will never forgive you if you send me to prison. They'll choose me over you, and you'll lose your entire family over this. David, I already lost my family when you stole my inheritance while I was fighting for my life. The only difference is that now I'm admitting it instead of pretending otherwise. Emma, please, I'm begging you. Give me a chance to make this right. Let me try to reverse the house sale and pay you back. Don't destroy our family over money. This was never about money, David. This was about you stealing the one thing that connected me to Grandmother Rose. The one thing that represented her legacy and dreams. You didn't just take my inheritance, you took my future and hers. She's dead, Emma. She doesn't need a legacy. She doesn't need an art center. She needs us to take care of each other and be successful. That's what grandmothers actually want for their families. The casual dismissal of everything Grandmother Rose had valued, everything she'd specifically asked me to preserve, crystallized the fundamental difference between David and me. He saw her death as the end of her relevance to our family's decisions. I saw it as the beginning of my responsibility to honor her wishes. David, Grandmother Rose made me promise to keep her art alive. She left me that house specifically because she knew I would turn it into something that would help other people discover their creativity. You destroyed that promise for your personal financial gain. Promises to dead people don't matter more than obligations to living ones. I needed that money to protect our family from real consequences in the real world. The conversation had reached its natural conclusion. David remained convinced that his crimes were justified by his circumstances, and I remained committed to seeking justice regardless of the family consequences. David, I'll see you in court, and I'll see you in prison if the prosecutor decides your crimes warrant incarceration. As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange sense of peace settling over me. The confrontation I'd been dreading had finally happened, and David had revealed himself to be exactly as selfish and manipulative as his actions had suggested. There would be no redemption arc, no moment of genuine remorse, no acknowledgement of the harm he'd caused. Tomorrow would bring police reports and legal proceedings, family drama and public scandal. But tonight, for the first time since waking up in the hospital, I knew exactly who I was dealing with and what I needed to do. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.